All right, welcome to week one, Gender, Sex, and Orientation, Building a Shared Language. So this week we will understand the differences between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and attraction, examine the ways in which sex and gender are social constructs, learn terms related to LGBTQ identity, and become familiar with the stages of gender and sexual identity development. So I want to start by building a shared language because it's really important for us to develop a shared toolbox for what these terms mean and how we're going to be using them throughout the rest of this course. I want to direct your attention to one of the assigned documents and readings in the course for this week, which is the LGBTQ terminology sheet. You should definitely be using this and relating to it as you go through your lessons for the week, and will be useful as we continue on in the course. Something to keep in mind is that the terms in that sheet it is not exhaustive. Many of the terms there and their definitions are the most commonly understood definitions from these terms. And it's important to recognize that some folks might have a different way of describing what that term means to them, especially identities that they hold, and that's totally valid. What we want to do is just start developing a shared language so we have a better idea of what it is that we're talking about. So to begin, there are three main concepts that we really need to discuss that all of us have, but it's really important when it's talking about the LGBTQ community. Those three are sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So let's start with sex assigned at birth. So you might be thinking biological sex, and you might be unsure what I mean by assigned at birth. And so let me explain a little bit more about what we mean. So sex is a person's assignment at birth based upon primary and secondary sex characteristics, i.e. genitalia, breasts, body hair, chromosomes, hormones, etc. But what we mean by assigned is that each of these characteristics kind of have a natural variation and ranges in all sorts of different types of bodies, independent about what we as humans have categorized male and female. Modern science has determined what set of primary and secondary sex characteristics and the range of various other traits to then determine what it means to be male, female, and intersex. What's important to recognize is that these are still social constructions, right? They are still open to interpretation in some ways. It doesn't neatly and accurately always describe people's experiences and what their bodies look like. This is especially true for intersex folks. What can sometimes happen with intersex folks is the doctor and their parents might decide to surgically alter that young baby to bring their body in line with a gender binary way of living. So they might bring their body more in line with male to raise their child as a boy, or female as a woman, right, as a young girl. So this is something to keep in mind that's really important, specifically as it relates to intersex inclusion. And this is why it's important to recognize that even our bodies are a social construct. And our society also conflates sex with gender. And it's really critical that we separate these two things out, because just because you might know somebody's sex assigned at birth does not mean you know their gender identity. So gender, as a kind of an overarching concept, are the social constructions and expectations and norms and stereotypes that each society has created about different genders. Largely in Western society, a gender binary, that male-bodied people grow up to be men and female-bodied people grow up to be women. And so then gender identity is a person's inner understanding of the genders to which they belong or with which they identify. This is each person's unique knowing or feeling and is separate from a person's physical body or appearance, though it's often related. Right? So our gender identity is a very internal sense of who we know ourselves to be in this world. Our gender expression then is how we express that gender. It could be a person's behavior, mannerisms, interests, and appearance that are associated with gender in a particular cultural context, specifically within the categories of femininity or masculinity, as society has largely kind of created. This also includes gender roles. These categories rely on stereotypes about gender. So there are two terms about gender identity I want to really focus on right now, which are cisgender and transgender. So cisgender, cis is a Latin prefix that means on the same side. So it literally means my gender is on the same side as that which I was assigned at birth. So to kind of give you an example, and using myself, so I identify as a cisgender man. What that means is that when I was born, the doctor looked at my body and saw genitalia and other traits that is associated with male-bodied people, and so he assigned me male at birth. And because of that, my parents and society expected me to grow up to be a boy. In my case, that is true. While I was always a more effeminate child, I'd like to play dress up and Barbies and still like Disney princesses, I always knew myself to be a boy. And so that experience of knowing myself to be the gender that I was assigned at birth is called cisgender. It's a word that's come into use probably in the past 10 to 15 years because when we looked at the terms we had to describe our experiences, we had transgender and then we didn't have a word for non-trans folks. Sometimes people would use the word normal. And if we're trying to build equitable and affirming communities, calling some people normal and some people not normal is not the way to do that. And so that's why we use the term cisgender to describe those experiences of us that are comfortable in the gender identity, know ourselves to be the gender that was assigned with us at birth. So then this complements transgender or trans. Trans is a Latin prefix that means across. So it's literally my gender is across from what you were assigned at birth. It can be an umbrella term for a few different terms that fall under the trans umbrella. So gender non-binary, gender queer, trans, right? So that would kind of be its use as an umbrella term. A trans person might undergo many different types of transition, be it social transition with the changing of name, pronouns, documentation, things of that nature, and also medical intervention as well. But that process is very private and is up to each individual person to determine what is right for them in their journey. Not every trans person is going to have the same end goal in mind if they do decide to medically transition. And so that's something just to be mindful about. And one note of the term transsexual, it's not a word that is used very often anymore. There are definitely some folks that would still claim that as part of their identity, but it's just something to keep in mind that not many folks use it in the same way as it had been in the past, because it really focuses on our body and we're moving away from our focus of bodies to kind of how we identify. Right, so here you'll see kind of this cake that maybe could have been used at a gender reveal party, for example. And here is a perfect example of the gender binary and what does this mean, right? So there's only two, there's men and women, and that men are expected to like blue and sports and be athletic and all kinds of things, and then girls like pink and their dresses and tutus and princesses. If those are things that you like as women and men, that's really wonderful, and we're not trying to take that away from anybody. What is the problem is this forced expectation that you have to conform to these things, and that if you don't, that there's something wrong with you. Right, so some more additional terms around gender. Gender nonconforming really relates more towards expression and behavior. It can be very culturally specific. Some cultures have different norms for genders that are present in their society versus a Western culture. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's often used as a descriptor, but it can be used as an identity by some folks. So that's just something to be aware of. And some examples might be butch women, effeminate men, Janelle Monáe, a celebrity, Boy George, and Prince, for example. Gender creative is a term used primarily for youth, young people, and it's really to talk about falling outside of traditional cultural gender norms, maybe in kind of how you're expressing your gender or you're playing with your gender, toys and whatnot. The picture there might be of some young children who identify as gender creative. And it's important to recognize that it's very developmentally appropriate for young children to play with gender and try on different gender roles. So it may end up connecting with a trans identity later on in their childhood. They might understand themselves to be trans. And for other young children who are gender creative, that might not be the case. Any outcome is possible and should be affirmed, but it shouldn't be kind of an assumed one-to-one correlation that, oh, this child is gender creative, and so therefore they're going to understand themselves to be trans and know themselves to be trans. And so lastly, gender attribution is the act that all of us do when we look at somebody and make an assumption based on the cues they're giving us to assume their gender, right? It's categorizing people based on what they're wearing, how they're wearing their hair, the name they have, their tone of voice. It's usually based on cultural cues and past experience. And so something that we need to start working on is striving away from trying to assume somebody's gender and just really treat them for the person in front of us that demands respect just by being a living human. It takes some time because of how deeply we're socialized, right? When you think back to that cake and the gender binary, the gender reveal party, gender is deeply socialized into all of us from a really young age. And it was probably the first question asked about us before we were born. So it's a really difficult socialization to break, but it is really important that we are constantly trying to overcome those ways that we're socialized to better create a new world for our young people. Gender is really limitless. And so there's not really one way to be trans. Here are just a few examples of different trans celebrities and other people of note, just to kind of, again, illuminate this idea that there's not one way to be trans. Next is sexual orientation. So orientation is a pattern of emotional, romantic, and or sexual attractions. It's a person's a sense of one's own personal and social identity based on attractions to the behaviors expressing them, oftentimes linked to the genders of the person one feels those attractions towards. So many of these terms associated with sexual orientation you might already be familiar with, aren't super new, just because the conversation around LGBTQ inclusion and visibility, sexual orientation more recently, within the more recent past, has been driving the conversation, much to the detriment of gender identity and folks that are under the trans umbrella, which now is only kind of rightly reshifting. And one term around sexual orientation I just want to talk a little bit about is queer, which can be used in many different ways and has a couple of different meanings. There is a historical context for the word queer that has been used as a slur word. Many elders in our community, that was the word maybe used against them when they were children, that started to send the message that something about them was wrong and different. And so for them, it's a very painful and traumatic word. However, for younger generations, this is a word that's very powerful, and it's a word that they've reclaimed, because it's a word that they've used to reclaim this idea to describe their attractions to people that fall outside of gender and sexual norms. So attractions to trans, non-binary folks, genderqueer folks, right? So for those folks, this is a term that's very powerful and has to be seen for them to feel included. So this is just something to keep in mind, that it is a word with a complex history. And so just be mindful, if it's a word that somebody uses to describe themselves, you should reflect that back to them. And if it's not, or you're unsure, you should wait until you know for sure. The last way it could be used is as an umbrella term for the entire community, just because the alphabet soup is missing letters usually. It can be a mouthful if we keep adding words and letters. So that's why queer has kind of become an umbrella term for the entire community. Then lastly, I do want to hit on attraction, because young people in particular are really starting to separate out who we're attracted to and how we experience attraction, if at all. So your attractions then are feelings and desires a person has that may cause them to desire to engage in physically, sexually intimate behavior and or relationally, emotionally intimate behavior. So like flirting, dating, marriage, things like that. So there are some of these terms on your term sheet too. And again, this is something that young people in particular are really leading the charge in identifying terms and coming up with new words to describe how we experience attraction. So hopefully we can use this graphic, the gender unicorn from transstudent.org, to really lock these ideas into your brain. Gender identity is that internal sense of who we are in our head, the thought bubble, right? It's very much an internal dialogue. Gender expression is how we express that gender. It's the dotted line. Sex assigned at birth, the DNA symbol, right? And then the heart, just as we think about romance and sitting in the heart and all that symbolizes, so too, that's kind of representing the physical and sexual romantic attractions and who we're attracted to. And again, we are all unicorns. All of us have different components of this to our identity. The difference is that for some of us, those identities are supported by the larger society, and for others, it is not. And we have to navigate a society that wasn't necessarily built for us. So now I want to transition a little bit into understanding how we start to develop these identities about ourselves and the ages in which that happens. So here's a little kind of game we can play together. If you want to maybe try to answer to yourself before I reveal the answer. So at what age do people develop understandings of gender categories? So maybe think to yourself, which one is it? And you might be surprised to know that it's actually between 6 to 9 months. So if they hear a low voice, they would preferentially look to a man's face. But it's important to recognize that this is not a mature understanding of what this means, but rather just an early recognition of patterns in their environment, right? So this is not something that is baked into our DNA, but rather as young infants, our brains are primed to just start soaking up information about the world we now inhabit and develop patterns for thinking and navigating this world. And one of the biggest patterns that they're faced with is this gender binary. And so they're going to start associating different things into these patterns. And by age 2, they've already learned and internalized rudimentary gender stereotypes. So then based on those stereotypes, at what age do young people start to avoid peers who violate those gender norms? So the answer is 4 to 6. So by preschool, they will start to avoid peers who violate these gender norms. And then at what age do young people start to label themselves boy and girl? You might have caught on now that it's much earlier than maybe you anticipate. So between 2 and 3 years of age, they will start to label themselves with a gender identity. By age 3 to 4, they internalize the belief that gender is stable. A boy does not grow up to be a girl. And between 5 and 7 have internalized that gender expression does not change someone's gender. So again, these are not these like set in stone baked into the cake of human existence, but rather these are the patterns that they're picking up, that the messages society is sending to them. And this is why it's so critical to have an intervention at a really young age, to talk about different gender identities beyond the gender binary, right? Because it's at this very young age that young folks are internalizing what this means to be different. So then let's start talking about what could be some signs then that a child might grow up to be trans. Is it engaging in play and hobbies not normative for their gender, dress up in other genders' clothes, gender non-conforming in their mannerisms, walk and play, or none of the above? The answer is none of the above. Research shows that it is developmentally appropriate for all children to engage in gender creative play, and the vast majority of those children don't grow up to know themselves as trans or non-binary. So then what does it mean to be a trans youth? A child is considered transgender if they express a consistent, persistent, and insistent gender identity that does not align with their assigned sex at birth. So consistent, they reliably claim the same gender identity. Persistent, so it's over the course of maybe 6 months. And they're insistent. They express their true gender identity resolutely or intensely. This might involve some very intense emotional reactions. So youth who express these characteristics often grow up to be transgender adults, but it's important to recognize many trans adults did not meet these criteria as children, largely because of the environments they were probably living in that really stifled any possibility for a non-gender binary identity. So then kind of closing it out with sexual orientation identity development, this is from the CAS identity model. But here are a few different stages that have been identified as young people start to understand what their sexual orientation means, especially for those of us that are identified as part of the LGBTQ community. Right, so identity confusion, that first awareness that you have these feelings, thoughts, and attractions. The comparison stage, you accept the possibility of LGBTQ identity and begin to internalize what that means for the larger life experience. Isolation is very common, especially without access to additional supports or the internet or other types of visible role models. Tolerance, so understand that they are not alone and seek out other folks to combat those feelings of isolation. Then getting into acceptance. The acceptance of self begins in understanding that they can lead a healthy, happy life, and there might be some tension between personal and society norms there. Then the pride phase, they immerse themselves in their LGBTQ identity. They could come out of the closet, may prefer community of mostly other LGBTQ folks. And then synthesis. The sexual orientation becomes integrated into the larger identity in one aspect of their whole self. These are things, when I first heard about them, a lot of times the later stages tracked really well to college experiences and college age, so like traditional college age, I should say, so 18 to 22 years of age. But now, as visibility has increased, I think you'll find that folks are maybe going through these stages earlier in life, or maybe not at all. Maybe they can go really straight to, they're in a really supportive environment, and so maybe some of the more harder parts of this aren't as present. But they still need to navigate what does it mean to be a marginalized person and not part of the dominant group as it relates to orientation. So that kind of brings us to the end of our PowerPoint for the week. So just some activities for you to work on to help better explain some of these topics. One is gender boxes. This will allow you to think a little bit more about how gender operates in society. I then want you to use the discussion forum to reflect on your experience with this activity. And then using the terminology sheet as your guide, your assignment for this week will be to test out your knowledge with a little mini quiz worksheet where you'll have to use a word bank and categorize what it is that each term is referring to. So that's it for this week. Please contact me if you have any questions about this PowerPoint or any of the other activities, and I will see you next week.